Zoe Marks is a lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she's core faculty at the Carr Center for Human Rights and on the executive committee of Harvard Center for African Studies. Her research and teaching focuses on conflict and political violence, peace building and social movements, and gender inequality. Her current book projects examine the internal dynamics of rebellion in Sierra Leone and women's participation in violent and nonviolent social movements around the world. Professor Marks is also conducting research with the UN and other organizations to understand how wartime experiences shape individual well-being and community reintegration after war. Professor Marks holds a doctorate in politics and a master's degree in African Studies from the University of Oxford, as well as a BA in government and African American Studies from Georgetown University. Prior to joining the Kennedy School, she was a Chancellor's Fellow and lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, where she directed the master's program in African Studies and was director of the university's Global Development Academy. She's previously worked for the UN and non-governmental organizations in Ethiopia, France, Sierra Leone, South Africa, the UK, and the US. Dr. Marks, thank you so much for joining us today on this important topic. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Erica, and to the whole team at the Executive Education Program at the Kennedy School. It's really an honor to be with you all today, and thanks to those of you who are joining now and those of you who listen to this webcast later. I'm going to go ahead and share some slides for today's conversation, and I want to emphasize that we will have at least half of our session hopefully dedicated to Q&A. I look forward to hearing more about the work that you all are doing around the world, how you're trying to pursue gender justice and intersectional equality. But because we're a broad audience, I want to take a moment to just pause on some of the sort of forms of gender violence that we've seen just this week. I want to recognize the women that were killed in the United States in the attacks in Atlanta, which were both racist and misogynistic. I want to recognize the attacks on those fighting for democracy in Myanmar and the women at the front lines, and also recognize the conversations that are happening this week in particular around women's freedom of movement and right to safety in the world, particularly in light of the murder of Sarah Everard in the United Kingdom. And so with these in the back of my mind, I thought, what can we really talk about in just 30 minutes and in an hour-long conversation about such a large topic of global feminism in the 21st century? I'm going to tackle 3 questions that I think will really kickstart the conversation and that hopefully are applicable to a broad range of work that you all are doing in different sectors. First, I want to just briefly answer the question that I ask my students at the start of the semester, which is, what does feminism mean today? And another way of asking that question is, what does feminism mean to you? Now, I can't answer that. But the second question that we'll look at is, what are the key issues that women are facing? And then finally, what tools does feminism or global feminist thinking offer for how we think about kind of global challenges, not just women's challenges? So what does global feminism mean today? I'm borrowing Bell Hooks, a Black feminist thinker's definition of feminism and adapting it for a global context. And today, when we talk about feminism, what it really means is the movement to end sexist and gender-based oppression, both locally and transnationally. And the local and the transnational is really important for thinking about global feminism because it's rooted in thinking about our personal relationships, our personal experiences of the world as being embedded in larger systems of power, and specifically embedded in patriarchal power structures or power structures that overrepresent men and that sort of support the continued domination of men in the gender binary. Distinguishing features of global feminism, and I'm happy to talk more about these at length in the Q&A session, is that global feminism today in the 21st century is gender inclusive. It's increasingly thinking about feminism and the fight against sexist oppression as something that not only involves men and women, but that involves people of all genders, including non-binary people. It's intersectional, which means that sexist oppression or gender-based oppression can't be separated from other forms of inequality, oppression, and violence. So what that means is if you live in a society that's affected by racism or caste hierarchies, if you live in a society like all societies around the world today that struggles with economic inequality, these class, race, and caste-based divisions actually shape the nature of sexism. They shape the nature of patriarchal power, both locally and globally. Moreover, global feminism today is attuned to power inequalities. This is the difference between feminism as a political project against oppression, and something like sort of just gender equity in the corporate setting that doesn't take an explicitly feminist lens. And so that's not to say that you can't have corporate or political projects that are feminist, but one of the kind of key pinch points for me is, are you talking about power? Are you talking about resources and representation that is substantive and not just tokenistic? So feminism is at its core interested in power and access to power and opportunity and protection and freedom. And then the last two features are that global feminism is inherently pluralistic. So when I said, what does feminism mean to you? That is to invite you into a conversation where feminism is always going to mean different things to different constituencies, because of the aforementioned features of it being intersectional, about multiple layers and levels of inequality, gender inclusive, about people with different gender identities coming together to work towards a freer and more just world. And so that pluralism leads to the sort of contested nature of global feminism. I'm unfortunately not here today to tell you that feminism is now hugely popular and not at all stigmatized. It remains something that is contentious internally within feminist movements, that different communities of gender equity activists have different ideas about the path to achieving equality and justice. But it's also contested, of course, in terms of people who are skeptics, who believe still that feminism is somehow against men, that think that feminism is going to inevitably oppress women by forcing them out of the home where they maybe find happiness and into some sort of corporate tyranny, or whatever stereotype people have about feminism. Those continue to shape a sort of defensive posture of global feminism. And so what I want to focus our conversation on is really going beyond this defensive posture, going beyond these internal debates and dichotomies, and really talking about some of the common threads and the key insights that you can take away from our conversation today and apply this afternoon, apply tomorrow, apply in the years ahead to sort of maintain our innovative edge in thinking about gender equity. So the key issues I'm going to talk about, and I'll have to move quickly to make sure that we have time for dialogue, is I'm going to talk about what I think is the most obvious kind of core event that's gendered in our world today, which is the gendered costs and consequences of the current global pandemic of COVID-19. And I'll amplify some of the successes that this kind of pandemic and its consequences have revealed. I'm also going to talk about democratic backsliding. You may notice that the global pandemic and democratic backsliding are not women's issues. They're key issues affecting the world that we live in, and they have gendered consequences. But I'll also talk about the role of women in social movements and some of the new research that I'm leading with my co-author Erica Chenoweth on the role of gender-inclusive social movements in protecting and expanding access to democracy. And then finally, I'll wrap up with a snapshot of some of the persistent gaps in gender equity. And one of the successes we see is that gender gaps are closing in health and education, but they're really very, very slow to close when we look at sort of power and authority, and particularly decision-making in the political sphere. So I'm going to talk about these kind of challenges and successes, and I'll end with a quick slide that highlights some of the key tools that I hope these challenges and successes reveal for us. So first, to talk about the gendered costs of COVID-19. I expect some of you are all too familiar with this literature that's emerged in the past 12 months of the global pandemic and the lockdown. But in case you're not, I wanted to summarize some of the key findings. First of all, we went into the global pandemic in a global health system that not only was inequitably distributed in terms of access to healthcare, access to things like respirators. One of the countries that I have the strongest research connection to, Sierra Leone, which I'll talk about at the end of our time together. They only have one ventilator when the pandemic started for the whole country. So there's inequity in access to healthcare globally, but more important for our conversation about gender inequity, the global health system is led by men, but it is overwhelmingly delivered by women. 70% of health workers globally are women. Europe is the only region where we see a majority of doctors being female. Outside of Europe, around the rest of the world, most doctors are men. They earn more, so there's an enormous gender pay gap in the health sector, but also the frontline workers that were responding to COVID-19 were overwhelmingly female. So in India, you have community outreach workers, 900,000 of them who were the front lines of the response, particularly in rural communities across the country. They're considered volunteers. So they're not only not paid, but they didn't have PPE, personal protective equipment. They didn't even have access to hand washing or to, hand sanitizer, face masks, et cetera. As a result of this high concentration of women at the front lines of healthcare delivery, but lack of access to power and health systems leadership, we saw that the majority of the infected health workers around the world were women. So in Spain, 72% of health workers infected with COVID were women. In Italy, 66%. Here in the United States, 73%. And what's important to kind of recognize here is that this runs against our sort of what's called a male default in feminist scholarship. The male default is the assumption that because there are male doctors, healthcare is a male-dominated field. The male default also applies in science, where most biological science and most medical treatments have been built around the assumption of a male patient, despite the fact that every other person in the world is not male. And so by July 2020, a good 6 months into the pandemic having been declared, only 1 in 3 COVID cases had gender and age disaggregated data. So at a basic level, it's been difficult to kind of analyze the gendered costs of COVID-19, but also to have the gender responsive policy response. In terms of women's specific issues, people who can get pregnant, who are pregnant, had a really difficult time navigating the medical information about COVID-19. This is in part due to the novelty of the virus, but it was also due to the fact that pregnancy hasn't been baked into how we think about medical testing. It isn't baked into experimental design because of the desire to protect women and unborn fetuses. And so that has led to a sort of slower uptake in terms of thinking about how to provide care during a global pandemic for some of the most vulnerable women who are pregnant and new mothers. In spite of the sort of gender imbalance in the United States, men were much less likely to understand how COVID-19 was transmitted. They left the house more often, they washed their hands less often, and they were, in part as a result of these sort of behavioral dynamics, more likely to contract COVID-19 and more likely to have severe disease. So we saw headlines early on that men were being more affected by COVID, but in fact, the numbers of healthcare workers who were infected by COVID and the balance of preventive care was falling disproportionately on the shoulders of women. It goes without saying that marginalized groups have also faced higher infection and mortality rates, and this compounds the gender inequalities that I just reviewed. The Lancet was quick out of the gate to recognize this, but the changes in the midst of a pandemic have been slower to be observed. And the Lancet said that given their frontline interaction with communities, it's concerning that women have not been fully incorporated into global health security surveillance, detection, and prevention mechanisms. At the same time that we've seen the sort of health dynamic on the front lines of COVID, we've also seen one of the most severe consequences from a gender equity perspective, which is economic backsliding. People are describing what's happening in labor markets as a historic exodus of women. Commentators and researchers alike are calling it disastrous. In the United States in September of last year, 4 times more women than men left the labor market. But this is not just happening in the US, where the pandemic has been particularly acute. It's also happening globally. We've seen in Europe and Asia that women-owned businesses have been more likely than male-owned businesses to close. We've seen the sectors where women are most kind of predominant, some of the most affected. So 70% of domestic workers lost their jobs in the early stages of the pandemic. 80% of domestic workers are female. We also saw a 50% drop in working hours for women across Asia. And other sectors like the tourism industry and other service sectors, as well as some garment factories, have been some of those sectors that have been hit hardest. Conversely, there are male-dominated sectors like construction and infrastructure and agriculture in some countries and regions that have been a bit more resilient and faster to bounce back. As a result, in part of this exodus from labor markets, and also in part due to the nature of poverty and how gendered poverty is distributed, we've seen that more women are in extreme poverty now than men as a result of the pandemic, and that the projections for the next 10 years show that this is going to be a gap that will be almost impossible to close. And so the shock of COVID actually has longer term effects in the numbers of women living in extreme poverty compared to men. Unfortunately, we know that economic and labor market recovery after emergencies and disasters and economic disasters is slower for women. And part of this is because of the care burdens at home that women end up having to leave labor markets in part to respond to contractions in support for the household. During COVID, it's largely due to closure of schools and childcare facilities. So lack of access to childcare makes women more likely than men to leave their jobs. But in light of these sort of hits on women's economic power and hits on economic autonomy, we also have seen that men are entering the labor market at faster rates than women. This is a really beautiful, but unfortunately distressing graphic that comes from a UN Women report that I encourage you to look up that looks at gender equality in the wake of COVID-19. And what it reflects is the intensified unpaid care or domestic workload. So that's that housework and care work in the family that I was just referring to. And it's gone up incredibly for women, and it's gone up significantly, but not nearly as much for men. And so what this shows is that the COVID-19 pandemic is compounding pre-existing inequalities. It's not spontaneously creating new forms of sexism, but rather it's compounded underlying inequalities between men and women in access to care, in access to work, and also in the kind of burden of work at home or the unpaid labor that's required to maintain human well-being. I promised that we'd also talk about some of the successes that have been revealed. Feminist leadership is one of the most important success stories to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic. You can see the headline of an op-ed that I wrote relatively early on last year, that women leaders around the world seem to be performing better on average. Early on, people said, well, this seems to be a blip. We have not enough numbers to say that this is persistent. It's too soon to tell. In fact, over time, we've seen that these countries do tend to perform better on average. Not all countries, of course. Belgium is a notable exception. But it's not because they're women, of course. It's not because these countries are led by women that they're doing better. It's because women leaders happen to be the ones who are exercising more competent and consistent crisis leadership. They're communicating clearly, they're flexible with their health policies and responsiveness, they're taking science-based decisions, and they're more risk averse. These are not gender exclusive traits. In fact, the countries that have performed best with male leaders also demonstrate this type of crisis leadership that's responsive to science, that makes hard decisions, that communicates clearly to the public, and that adapts as the public health situation allows. And so the reason why it matters that women are doing so well against the pandemic is that it shows us not only that they have skills that men can learn from if we kind of move beyond some of our masculinist ideas about leadership, taking risks, being overly decisive, being single-minded, or working alone. These are traits that are often valued in male leaders, and there's public opinion polling that demonstrates this. But some of the traits that are valued most in women leaders actually benefit male leaders as well. The second reason this is important is because of the demonstration effect. It actually matters symbolically when we see women in power and when we see them succeed, particularly when we see them succeeding in adverse circumstances. So that's a real win for feminist leadership globally, and also for male leaders who are seeking to learn from success stories. The second big story that's coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic is that this sort of feminist leadership doesn't only happen at the head of state level or even at the sort of head of health systems level. It's also happening at the grassroots. I wanted to amplify the state of Hawaii's gender recovery policy called Building Bridges, Not Walking on Backs. This is just one example of some of the gender inclusive responses, which have led to healthier economies that have focused on getting children back in school, not only because it helps their well-being and educational development, but also because it helps broaden access to the labor market and restore the economy more quickly. And there's also been successes in thinking about providing support not only to people in formal employment, but also to people who work at home or who work in unpaid labor, and people who work in the informal sector, both of which tend to be dominated by women. The second key theme that we're going to move through, and we'll move through this one a bit more quickly because I don't need to go into all the data, but democratic backsliding and patriarchal authoritarianism has been on the march for the past decade. This is happening at the same time that COVID-19 is happening, so they're not unrelated, but we have seen a decade-long decline in democracy around the world. Some of my colleagues in political science are calling this the third wave of autocratization. We used to talk about the third wave of democratization, which was a sort of expansion of democracy around the world. We even referred to it at times as the end of history, that there was an inevitable ascent of a liberal order. In fact, we're now seeing significant backsliding equivalent to the levels we saw in 1990. One of the things that's happening at the same time with the pandemic is that we're seeing more emergency restrictions that are being imposed, and they're often being imposed indefinitely. And we're seeing 2 in 3 countries imposing media restrictions. So this is a real threat to democratic health and well-being generally, but it's also leading to some real backsliding with gendered implications. In 2019, the year before the pandemic, we saw the most mass movement participation and mobilization in human history. We saw more people participating in social protests and democracy movements than ever before. And yet in 2020, we saw one of the lowest years for participation in mass movements in recent history. This graph on the right-hand side shows that precipitous drop in mobilization for democracy. You can see that there's been a steady increase across regions around the world. Again, I'm looking at the mobilization for democracy graph here. Up until 2019, the highest year, and then by 2020, it declined. What you can make out more difficultly is the gender equality graph on the left-hand side. What I want to tell you about is some of the new research that I've been doing that demonstrates the relationship between mobilization for democracy and increased gender equality. So you can see on the right-hand side that since 1900, there was a slow and then ultimately relatively dramatic increase in respect for gender equality. The Middle East and North Africa region is the lowest performer across those lines. You can see that Africa follows it. And it's led by Europe, which is itself highly dynamic and diverse, and led by the Nordic countries, which have the highest levels of gender equity. But what you can also make out is that there's been a slight but subtle and important decrease in gender equity in 2020. And this represents sexist backlash. When we see democratic backsliding, we gradually start to also see that democratic declines are hurting women and gender minorities. One of the reasons that this happens, it's not inevitable, but it happens because authoritarian leaders tend to rely on traditional norms and patriarchal social institutions to consolidate their power. Homophobia and scapegoating have become really prominent against the LGBT community. We've seen anti-gay rhetoric, but also anti-gay laws across a number of African countries, as well as in Central America and in Central Europe. We've also seen that authoritarian leaders are more likely to promote traditional gender roles. They amplify feminized characteristics for women that keep women in the home, that keep women subservient to men. And they also amplify toxic masculinity that leans on violence, that leans on exclusion. Another key feature of sexist backlash, and this is again coinciding with democratic backsliding, are attacks on women's health and particularly sexual and reproductive health services and freedom. So this takes the shape of laws against abortion, but also laws restricting women's access to contraceptive care, restricting women's decision-making power over their bodies. And yet, the other side of the story is that in the past 10 years, we've seen more and more women in resistance movements. And what's really important about women in resistance is that it means that as women participate in larger and larger numbers, they're also able to grow resistance movements that are nonviolent. So we've seen that in new research I'm doing with Erica Chenoweth, democratic gains are more likely when you have more women participating in a mass movement for democracy. These gains that are caused by women's frontline participation extend to people of all genders, of course, throughout society, but they also help to consolidate gender equity and empowerment. What this signifies is that women's empowerment and gender equality is being claimed by women who take to the streets and demand accountability and legitimacy from their governments. It's not something that's just granted because a country is wealthy or granted because a leader in power believes that human rights are important. In fact, human rights become important when women and people across society take to the streets and demand that their rights are respected. I want to show you a little bit what this looks like over time to give you a sense of what's happening from a gendered perspective behind those line graphs that I just showed you. So the line graphs were from the Varieties of Democracy project. You can navigate all of their data free of charge online. You don't need any special statistical skills. But here's some data that I've pulled together that looks at violent and nonviolent campaigns around the world and the percentage of women participating at moderate or extensive levels. And so all of these campaigns that you see are campaigns that have 25% or greater frontline participation by women. That means 25% or more of the people on the front lines of mass movements are female on all of these bar graphs. And all of the campaigns that you're seeing over time, particularly in the past 15 years, have been nonviolent. We don't see large levels of women participating in armed movements. I'm happy to talk about why that is in the Q&A session. But we also see that the shift to nonviolent movements, when it succeeds, it leads to the expansion of democracy for all. So for those of you who've been following what's happening in Myanmar, now's a really important time to keep your eye on the headlines. Women have been at the front lines of the protests for the past month, but increasingly as we see rhetoric from the democracy movement about potentially pursuing violence, we would expect that that would close space to an extent for women's full participation. It will probably make the democracy movement smaller, and it increases the risk of failure because we know that nonviolent movements and movements that include women in large numbers are more likely to succeed. The last kind of core trend I want to talk about, and I'll close with a story from last summer, is about the persistence of gender gaps. So the image here is a campaign by UN Women on the gender pay gap. It's perhaps the one that's most commonly talked about in feminist work. And it's not the only pay gap that we're interested in, right? Or it's not the only gender gap that we're interested in. A gender gap simply refers to differences between men and women in indicators or indices, which combine multiple indicators of power and well-being. It does not capture the overall level of power and well-being. So when we think about the gender gap between men and women, it doesn't tell us if overall either men or women are doing well enough from a health and welfare perspective. And it also requires intersectional analysis to be properly understood. So often the gender gap is very, very different according to race, caste, religion, and other minoritized or marginalized identities. And the result of that means that the gender gap can look much smaller than it is if it's driven by people at the top, or it can look much larger than it is at the top because people at the bottom have severe levels of inequality. And then finally, I want to just stress that gaps are often arising from systematic gender roles. There are systematic biases that have been baked into society and baked into expectations of what women and men should do to be sort of good people, good citizens, valued. It's not usually driven primarily by individual discrimination. So individual experiences of sexist discrimination, to use the pay gap as an example, account for roughly 2 cents of a pay gap that is anywhere from 23 to 30 cents on the dollar. So most of that 23 to 30 cents on the dollar gap between what women earn overall and what men earn in a year is really driven by differences in life. It's differences in access to jobs. It's by differences that have been shaped by the patriarchal labor market and economic distribution of value that goes beyond individual sexist discrimination. So I want to share here, before I get to my final anecdote, about the Global Gender Gap Index. So this is a snapshot of 2020. It doesn't capture change over time. Rather, it captures the spread of where countries are globally on the overall gender gap, which compiles 4 gender gaps below it. So there's an economic opportunity and participation index that's just below the overall gender gap index. There's education index, which is the 3rd line down. There's health and survival. And then the last one, the very bottom, shows political empowerment. Now, the reason I want to show this is, first of all, if you can see any of the countries that are represented here, you can see some surprising winners. It is not just sort of the Nordic or Scandinavian countries that are at the front of every single index. Kenya, for example, does very well on women's health and survival. The gender gap is very small there. On the other hand, you can see China has a large gender gap on health and survival. Political empowerment continues to be the area where we see the slowest progress in the gender gap. So to give you a sense of some of the change over time, this is just looking at the past 15 years. This shows each of those sub-indices broken out over time. And the bottom line is the progress that we've made towards gender equality and political empowerment. It is well below 30%. So the progress towards closing the gap is that we've only closed approximately a quarter of the gender gap in political power. And this is in spite of the fact that almost half of the world's countries have some form of gender quota that's been introduced in the past 10 or 15 years. And so what we've seen at the sort of global level in terms of pursuing gender equality is we've seen two things. One, we've seen that health and education have closed relatively rapidly, but there's enormous variation across the world. And we've also seen that access to economic power and access to education has not led to automatic gains in access to political power for women. I mentioned I wanted to kind of close with a story from last summer. So gender gaps have been closing slowly, but progress has come from concerted and directed action. Over the last summer, I worked with the Ministry of Education in Sierra Leone, a country that I know well. And I worked with the minister and his team to think about how can we protect girls' education in light of previous policies that discriminated against pregnant girls specifically, and also in light of the fact that after Ebola, which affected Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea, we saw girls returning to school at much lower rates than boys. And so in trying to think about how do we kind of protect girls' enrollment, how do we protect and close the gender gap in education, I worked with a team of students at the Kennedy School, and we found that in fact, Sierra Leone had already closed the gender gap in education. This wasn't even reflected in the data that the World Bank had, but when we dug deeper, we found that in fact, the gender gap was primarily occurring only in rural areas. Nationally, the gender gap in education had been closed, but for rural girls, there were specific life shocks that made it more likely that they would drop out of school and that made it harder for them to return to school. So specifically, we found that when girls went from junior secondary to senior secondary school, there was a substantial drop in girls' enrollment that gradually recovered. And then again, when they basically became 18 years old, which was a sort of social childbearing and marriage age, there was another drop in enrollment for girls. And so as a result of this, we tried to have conversations with the ministry that said, first of all, there's a success story here, which is that Sierra Leone used to have a massive gender gap in education and in literacy, and it's been closed in the past 10 years. In the 20 years since the war ended, we've seen dramatic development progress in one of the poorest countries in the world, but we've also seen this progress in the gender gap. What we haven't seen is commensurate progress in social power or political power. And so the focus for the ministry right now is thinking about how do we challenge social norms if we have girls in school? What can we do to provide the sort of concerted action that got girls' education straight to equity and beyond equity at the primary school level to begin driving equity in these other domains where there's still sexism, where there's still patriarchal discrimination? And that's the conversation that we all need to be having. These are the key tools that I want to end on, and I'm so excited to hear some of the questions from the audience and some of your experiences pursuing feminist progress. But the key tools are to think gender inclusively and expansively. One of the things to watch out for is when there's a male default, we actually close our minds to all of the information that we need to solve political and policy problems. And we also overlook some of the contributions of women and other gender minorities. You should think about how can you center the margins in your work. It is more important than ever to look for where inequalities intersect and compound. We know that in moments of crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic, but also over the longue durée, the world is becoming more and more equal. And gender is a piece of this puzzle. If we can begin to close gender inequalities intersectionally, then we can begin to tackle some of the other major problems of our time, including racism, class inequality, and other forms of discrimination. And then finally, I want to invite you to call for feminist aspirations. There are several countries in the world that have feminist foreign policies, most recently Mexico, but also Canada, France, and Sweden was the first country to have a feminist foreign policy. I'm still waiting for the Biden administration to announce their new feminist foreign policy, but turning feminism into a word that speaks to all of our hopes for progress, all of our hopes for gender representation and equity and justice, is one of the most important ways to actually achieve change. We saw what the Millennium Development Goals did for girls' education, and now we're in the midst of the Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, this week is the UN Commission on the Status of Women, the 65th Commission on the Status of Women. There is no shame in calling for feminist change. There's no shame in calling for feminist progress. In fact, feminism at its best helps all of us become free of harmful gender roles, harmful traditional practices, and find a way to maximize our well-being as not just individuals, but members of families, communities, and societies. And so I'll close there, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Zoe. We've had a few questions come in. So I'm going to start with a question about the gender gap and how much of a role do you think women play in the gender gap in politics? Meaning, how likely are women to vote for a man over a woman who is running for the same office?
This is a great question. I will say the answer varies, and we don't have great data across nationally. So we know that women are as likely as men to have sexist ideas, right? We've internalized sexism all of our lives. And so there are a lot of ways that women work to sort of support and sustain patriarchy. And so how that translates to electoral politics is both in terms of how women talk about other women in office, the way that women sometimes project their own fears about women seeking power, women seeming ambitious, women seeming confident or hard-elbowed, sharp-elbowed. There's both anecdotal and quantitative survey data that finds that sometimes women are actually harsher against other women than men. And yet we also know that women are more likely in the United States, at least, to vote for to vote for women than are men. And this is partly because women are more likely to vote for progressive candidates in the US. So I really want to caution us extrapolating from US voter data about what's happening elsewhere in the world, and even caution against extrapolating from national data what's happening locally. And this isn't intended as a cop-out, but I'm doing research in Northeast Nigeria, and it's looking at the role of women in sort of excluding members of the former terrorist group Boko Haram in an effort to protect their communities. So one of the common stereotypes that we have about women is that they're more empathetic, they're more inclusive, they're more open. In fact, in the research that I've been doing with colleagues and with the UN in Northeast Nigeria, we've seen that women are actually more likely to be socially exclusionary in that context, partly because they perceive a greater threat. And so there are lots of ways that we can think about gender behavior to both sort of support patriarchy or to discriminate against women, but also that does eventually flip, and women become usually the greatest champions for seeing women in political power.
Great, thank you. Another question. I've noticed a rise in women leading nonviolent citizen protests from Myanmar, Nigeria, Somalia, and Sudan. So what do you attribute to this to, particularly since those societies are very patriarchal?
That's a great question. What causes women to take to the streets? And I'm going to lean a bit here on my research on women in armed movements. It's a little different, and I'll tell you how. But in the study of women in rebel movements, which is where we would perhaps least expect to see women on the front lines, we've seen that women have as many reasons to participate as do men. So one of the things to keep in mind is when women engage in risky democratic action or the pursuit of social justice, when they put their bodies in front of riot police, when they stand together in solidarity in support of marginalized communities, they're often doing so for not overtly gendered reasons, right? All people are courageous. All people care about one another's well-being and their own role in kind of collective liberation. And so there's a question around what activates it, what leads to that cognitive liberation, where any of us can imagine ourselves to live differently, to live otherwise, to live in a freer society. And there, I don't think we have any evidence that suggests men and women have different thought processes or different access to personal and collective courage. But what is different is when you have nonviolent movements, there's more scope for women to engage in a variety of roles at the front lines and in support roles and in leadership than you have in military or rebel movements, right? So when you have armed resistance, it is much more embedded in masculine ideas of violence, masculine ideas of power and strength. And it's more likely to exclude women or to rely on women in very kind of narrow roles like espionage or trafficking items at the rear, trafficking weapons, that sort of thing. Conversely, you think of a nonviolent movement, there's almost infinite potential for people to show up. And one of the things that's been really exciting about the new Women in Resistance project that I've been doing with my colleague is that we've been documenting all of the different forms of gendered resistance and tactical innovation that women have access to. And so one of the things that's unique about the way we have gendered social roles in different communities around the world is all of those roles have different knowledge and networks attached to them, right? So it was actually women in Ireland who invented the term boycott because there was an English officer that was imposing colonial rule in Northern Ireland. And excuse your politics, whatever your politics are, but an English officer and the women in the community refused to work for him and they refused to sell to him. And that's where the term boycott comes from. Similarly, as we think about the women who were the face of the Sudanese revolution in 2018 to 19, it was also women at the rear who had gone on strike, that had refused to sell tea, who had instead of selling foodstuffs, they were providing them to the people who were at the sit-in at Army headquarters. And so both in the sort of iconic political speech realm and in the sort of logistics of how do you sustain protest under hardship and violence, women have played a really important role.
Great, thank you. We've gotten a couple of questions. I'm going to combine them here about the role of men or feminist men in supporting the movement. Someone specifically is mentioning in Mexico, there are a lot of feminist groups that don't agree on the inclusion of men. So what's your opinion on that?
That's a great question. It sounds like there are probably different angles to that question that you've pulled together. So I'm happy to circle back to it. But in short, I think feminism helps to liberate everyone. And so I think it's inevitably going to require the participation of people of all genders. What I want is for men to feel confident saying that they're feminist and to understand that their feminism is not for other people, but also for themselves. And this is a little bit delicate to say because we need to actually center women and center women survivors and find ways for people who have been exploited or oppressed because of their gender identity to feel safe. But that also doesn't mean that men have no role to play, or that men shouldn't be having conversations with other men about the ways that masculinity has affected their life, about the ways that they have faced violence or bullying or intimidation because of how they express themselves, right? That one of the things that is important in feminist work is to make room for multiple conversations and to see them as complementary. And so I wouldn't ever dare to tell feminists in Mexico how to create space and hold space for survivors, or how to create conversations that are liberatory and women-centered or amplifying women's voices. But I would say that if you want people of all genders, and particularly men, to be able to access the knowledge created in feminist movements and to be able to imagine an alternative world, they have to have some access to the liberatory project. Because if it isn't inclusive of all people, then we end up with these sort of balkanized visions of the future. And that becomes much more entrenched as we move forward.
Great, thank you. We have a question. Are there any studies on the contradiction of how we happily assign women most of the work on raising people and then do not find them capable enough to lead in politics? Considering most world leaders were raised by women, sometimes even only by women, how can they raise leaders but not allow them to be one? Not be one.
There's heaps of work on this. I won't try to summarize it because I actually think the way the question is framed is really important. What ends up happening, to answer the question as it's worded, is maternal skills are essentialized to women. So instead of thinking of parental skills, we often think of mothering as somehow a distinct, and there are biologically distinct attributes of mothering because we're animals, but mothering is seen as a sort of reified, gender essentialized skill that women have that doesn't translate, right? And then to the extent that there are these stereotypes that do translate, like, stereotypes about women's ability to multitask because they're moms, or their ability to kind of manage crisis because they're moms, that is often not carried over into visions of what public leadership, and particularly political leadership, looks like. Why exactly that happens, why some stereotypes, attach so firmly to women, but then don't attach to leadership, I would point you towards some of the psychology research that's been done on gender roles. But I think that, what's important to remember is that it shows that actually mothering is devalued. It's not paid, even though it's the only way that capitalist production is possible. I'm not suggesting that we should pay people for having children, although there's also now the commodification of reproduction, and we do pay people to have children. But it's not valued in terms of its power politically. It's seen as something that is nurturing at best, and not actually structuring society.
Thanks. I have a question about the data, and someone saying it's a little difficult to tell where there's a statistically significant difference. So do you have some examples about countries that are doing better or worse, and which are performing significantly better or worse on the criteria?
I'm not sure if this is referring to the gender gap or to COVID-19. I will say that so if we are interested in the statistical significance of women leaders, that data is pretty hard to come by because the confidence intervals, or the margin errors, are quite large. And that's because there's such a small number of countries that are women-led. In terms of thinking about statistical significance on the gender gap, there I encourage you to look at the World Economic Forum gender gap reports. They're published on an annual basis, and they give you a lot of descriptive data, but they also provide some examples of where you can find a statistically significant increase or decrease. And I guess if the question is focused on statistical significance of women in nonviolent and violent resistance movements, that's the research that I've done. And we do have significance across both the increase in size of movements when women are included, and also the increased success rate. So both of those have statistical significance at the 0.95%.
Great. Another question, do you have comments on patterns in women's protests in authoritarian contexts today? Is it different? Is it any different from forms of protest by women in democracies? And if so, how? This person is thinking specifically of Belarus and Russia and Ukraine.
That's a really interesting question, especially in light of those countries, which I'm an Africa specialist. So I will say that I don't have detailed information. I've never been on the ground in any of them. But one of the challenges that women face in authoritarian settings is really that there is not usually a robust history of women organizing in formal politics. And so this can be both a blessing and a curse, if you will. Blessing is probably overstating it, but some of the advantages of not having a lot of space for a formal opposition means that women haven't necessarily been crowded out of partisan political party structures. In formal democracies, you tend to have political parties playing a much bigger role in shaping the narrative and in shaping the agenda. And so then it can actually become more difficult to use protest as a key vehicle for change, because a significant proportion of people seeking, for example, gender equality or protections for civil rights and liberties are interested in using formal institutions like the legal system or like political parties to create that change. And I would say that, overall, once people become convinced that they need to take mass action, that they need to sort of form a social movement or use protest movement tactics, then there's not really a big difference in the tactics that people rely on, because the playbook for authoritarian states and for democracies is relatively similar.
Great. We have a question about quotas. So what's your opinion about quotas in companies?
Oh, this is a great question. I was just listening to a new study that was coming out that showed that quotas are incredibly effective. I wish I could remember the author's name. And if you email me I'm happy to share any of the sort of references that I've used in this talk or to point you towards other research. I think quotas are necessary and effective. I think that one of the things that quotas do is they're a strong signaling device that forces companies, but also countries or political parties, wherever they're implemented, to account for what they're doing about gender. And so even in places where we've seen a relative lack of progress, or where we've seen very elite women who look very much like the elite men that have been in positions of power, kind of being the ones who are brought into the fold, there is a shift in the conversation, and there's actually a shift in the representation, not only within sort of strategic reports or annual, shareholder reports in the context of corporations, but it does have a trickle-down effect in the media as well. So there's some research that suggests actually it doesn't just change the internal conversation, it changes the external conversation. I will say that there's not yet a strong evidence base that quotas actually transform life for women across the country, right? That's where the intersectionality lens becomes really important, to see the limits of quotas, that the people who do have access to power often look very much like the men who control the economy and politics otherwise.
And then a question about COVID. When you talk about how issues related to COVID may intersect with and compound pre-existing gender inequities, what are your thoughts about the lagging data about COVID prevention and management for pregnant and breastfeeding people? What do you think the short-term and long-term implications of this data gap are in the global context?
So I think there's a couple of data gaps, if I understand the question correctly. One is the data gap in how it actually affects pregnant and breastfeeding women. There will be data gaps in how COVID infection might affect conception or contraception. This data gap is huge. I hope lots of people are working on it. History suggests lots of people aren't working on it, and funding isn't being allocated to it. So the most important thing about the data gap is not just the lag, but whether it's going to be corrected and who will fund that work. There's also, there's a gap in data about the efficacy and impacts of the vaccine. This, because we know how vaccines work mechanically in the body, is less concerning than the data gap on how the virus works mechanically in the body, which we very much don't understand. So that's one thing. I think the other concern I have is the secondary data gap around the social implications of what this disruption means to women's access to healthcare and social relationships, and the social safety net that otherwise provides for, healthy motherhood and healthy pregnancies. And so that's the other data gap that's less specific to the virus, but more systemic. One of the things that we've seen whenever you have an epidemic, or in this case, a pandemic, is that access to ordinary forms of kind of preventive care and healthcare go down. And so I don't yet know what the numbers are on increase in maternal mortalities, on lack of access to antenatal care, and on lack of access due to COVID restrictions for women to get the sort of postpartum support that they need. And I think that this is something that we need to learn from. That is ultimately all we can hope for when it's this far gone.
I have a question. Are there comparative analyses concerning women's political empowerment between countries that have adopted the International Treaty Convention to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women and those that have not?
Interesting. Are there comparative analyses focused on CEDAW? I don't know. If you email me, I will look and see if I can find a comparative analysis that uses that convention as what you're thinking of. Is that like the sort of independent variable that explains other things. One of the challenges that we have when doing national or cross-national research on gender is that often countries that will ratify CEDAW have other attributes that already make them different. And so it can be hard to kind of figure out what CEDAW is the proxy for. And so you can imagine that if there are particular types of countries that are willing to ratify this convention, they may also have certain attributes that change what their outcomes would be on prevention or response to violence against women. That said, I will say that violence against women is a global problem. It very easily could have been numbers 1, 2, and 3 on the key things that are affecting global feminism today. And it's one of the key themes of the Commission on the Status of Women that's going on this week at the UN.
Thanks. We have a question about mobilization and legal representation, but I think I'm going to expand it just a little bit. So someone's asking about whether or not there are good lawyers out there that you can mention, or organizations that can help people who are looking to mobilize around pay gap issues and equity. Are there specific resources that people should be looking to as they're thinking about organizing and mobilizing?
Interesting. So I think it depends on whether you're thinking about the United States or if you're looking for global resources. UN Women has totally upped their game. They're doing amazing work in terms of data-driven advocacy, in terms of updated reporting on the pay gap generally, but also in terms of providing advocacy tools and comparative analyses of what different countries are doing around the world. So if you're interested in a global perspective, I would say always start with UN Women. They're fantastic on the pay gap, but they're also fantastic on things like violence against women, COVID-19, et cetera. Within the United States, I think it's the AAUW that has some of the best advocacy work, and again, data and research about the pay gap in the US. And there, one of the things that they've been really good about is trying to get more and more disaggregated data so that we can really understand which women, which categories or identity groups of women are being most affected by an extreme pay gap. Latinas in the United States earn 55 cents to the dollar for white men. Versus, sort of white women and Asian women who are earning closer to 79 or 81 cents on the dollar. And so they're doing some of the best intersectional advocacy work.
Great. And I think one last question, we'll end it on a positive note. So are there any silver linings in feminist advances, either politically or economically or other ways since the COVID pandemic?
I think it's hard to talk about silver linings from COVID. So I will just say that for those who've lost family, who've lost jobs, who've lost housing, this has been a really hard year. And even for those who are just trying to keep their families afloat and working from home, it's been a hard year. I think that the feminist advances I would point to are the ones I shared earlier, which is that we have seen women's leadership knock it out of the park. It's not to say that if you're a woman, you won't say stupid things and make bad policy choices. We've seen a lot of that in the United States as well, because, surprise, people of all genders can be boneheaded and anti-science, or they can be kind of flexible and clear and responsive and pro-science. But on balance, we have seen that women leaders have done a really good job keeping their states performing a little bit better cross-nationally. Within the US specifically, I think we've seen more penalties for women acting in feminist and feminized ways. And so I actually think that some of the progress that you've seen at the global level has been a little bit slower to advance in the United States. We have a very, very masculinist idea of leadership in the US. It's very sort of adversarial, go it alone. And unfortunately, that affects women because women are penalized if they're not kind of demonstrating that form of leadership. The one thing that I think is exciting, in addition to Hawaii's feminist recovery plan, which I hope all states replicate, is I think that there are now conversations at the grassroots level about community action, about mutual aid, about supporting one another. And there's also been, to some extent, a shift in men's awareness of household work, of the importance of supporting their families, and the importance of sharing parenting responsibilities. And so I don't know that these are affecting the majority, but I will say that awareness of inequality seems to have sharpened in the United States as a result of COVID. And I'm hopeful that both private and public sector leadership will really begin to push itself to think about, not just how do we build back better, but how can we actually transform our gendered expectations of the work people do and the work that's possible.